It is approaching 6 a.m. Friday on this 5th of December across the Philippines, and this is the latest 28storms.com update on Super Typhoon Hagupit as it approaches land. The latest advisory from the United States Joint Typhoon Warning Center indicates that maximum sustained winds are still near 145 knots, or between 165 and 170 miles per hour, still making this typhoon the equivalent of a dangerous Category 5 if we were talking about Atlantic Hurricane Saffir-Simpson scale standards. And it still looks as though the typhoon is going to make landfall across eastern Samar late Saturday night into Sunday morning. Now, as you see, we are expecting some weakening. The maximum sustained winds may diminish to around 125 knots, between 140 and 145 miles per hour. Still a very significant typhoon, a very dangerous typhoon that all interests in this area should be bracing for before conditions deteriorate. Anytime you're dealing with a tropical cyclone in the western Pacific Basin, there are multiple warning agencies that cover these systems. This is the latest forecast track from the Philippines Pagasa Weather Service office, and you can see there is fairly good agreement. If anything, potentially the Pagasa track is ever so slightly more toward the south, but it still shows a landfall across eastern Samar. The third and final warning agency is the official agency across the Western Pacific. That is the Japan Meteorological Agency. And out of the three primary forecasts, you see that, if anything, this track is the southernmost one out of the three, with a landfall across the southern part of the island. If I had to choose one of the three that I most favor in terms of the most probable outcome, I would have to choose the southernmost JMA forecast track, as it looks as though the model guidance has trended toward the south over the last 1 to 2 days. This is the latest look at the American GFS forecast model output, valid for 11 p.m. local time, just as the center of Typhoon Hagupit is progged to make landfall across eastern Samar, near or just around the city of Barangan, which has a population of about 65,000. Now, I know there has been a lot of comparisons to Super Typhoon Haiyan, which was the historic super typhoon that struck Tacloban, which is a little to the south of here, last November 2013. The storm was responsible for at least 6,000 deaths in the Tacloban area alone, so it is no wonder that people are in pins and needles on this side of the world when it comes to super typhoons. Now, there is a little bit of good news. For one, it looks as though this storm could be a little bit weaker as it's making landfall. And secondly, although this storm could pass very close to Tacloban, the overwhelming majority of guidance is keeping the center just to the north of the city. And if those model solutions do in fact verify, that would help to focus some of the highest storm surge, which is the deadliest part of the storm, a little bit to the north, and these coastal areas are a little bit less populated than the ones to the south. Tacloban City has a general population of about 225,000. Nonetheless, if you're near Barangan and this storm makes landfall in that area, you're still talking about a population of about 65,000 in that city alone. So this is still going to definitely impact tens of thousands of people right along the shoreline here, and this is a storm that could be very deadly if the proper precautions are not taken. I would also like to emphasize that the European ECMWF model solution has been the southernmost track and also the most persistent out of the forecast models over the last few days. And you can see based on this graphic, the model actually has the storm making landfall between Barangan and Tacloban. So at the very least, you're looking at significant winds here. If you live in a poorly constructed home or anything of that nature, you're definitely going to want to find better shelter, and certainly a shelter away from the storm surge threat along the immediate coast. Now, I know that the media will continue to focus on the storm surge threat, which made Haiyan so deadly in the Tacloban area, and if the center remains to the north, we're not going to get the water piled up or the storm surge build up across San Pedro Bay, but we will have to still monitor the storm over the next 24 hours in the event that this guidance tries to drift ever so slightly toward the south. So simply put, even though a landfall a little to the north is the more likely solution, everyone in this area should be bracing for the worst case scenario. Even with a weakening super typhoon, this is still going to be near a super typhoon nonetheless as it's making landfall. As we turn to the most recent satellite animation, there is some good news to report. As you can see, over the last 6 to 12 hours, the eye of the storm has become less defined. It has become a little bit more in the way of cloud filled, and some of the colder and stronger cloud tops have begun to weaken within the central dense overcast or the inner core of the storm. And this was somewhat expected, as it looked as though southeast wind shear was going to increase, and you can see that on the water vapor imagery a little better. If we compare the southeast quadrant of the storm compared to the northwest quadrant, you can see that the southeast side of the storm is being a little bit restricted here by dry air and the wind shear. It's not quite as symmetric. And we can see the wind shear pattern using the latest analysis from the University of Wisconsin. You can see the Philippines, here's our typhoon, and in terms of the wind streamlines, it shows a favorable upper level ridge, but it's centered to the east of the typhoon center, and directly over the typhoon you see those southeast winds in the range of about 20 to 30 knots. So there is a good bet of a little bit more in the way of weakening until the storm makes landfall, and then the weakening will become a little bit more substantial as it takes 2 to 3 days to cross entirely over the Philippines. Over the last 48 to 72 hours, the main steering mechanism has been a mid-level steering ridge which is centered over the Mariana Islands, and to the southwest of the steering ridge, the overall flow in the mid to upper layers of the atmosphere has been east-southeast to west-northwest, which has been the general movement of our typhoon. And the main forecast model discrepancies over the next 24 to 36 hours will be what exactly is this secondary mid-level ridge going to do currently situated over the South China Sea? Is this ridge going to drift east enough and also remain strong enough to allow the storm to bend a little bit more so toward the west, potentially closer to Tacloban over the next 1 or 2 days? Or is it going to continue its general west-northwest movement, which would take the storm more so over the northeastern part of Samar? As we take one final look on satellite imagery of Typhoon Hagupit, you can see that again the center is not quite as well defined, but make no mistake, this is a very powerful typhoon. If anything, over the past 1 or 2 hours we may be starting to see a slight bend more so toward the west, but it's really hard to determine with just a couple hours of a satellite animation. Sometimes the stronger typhoons tend to wobble back and forth, and you need to keep an eye on the overall 12-hour average in motion to really have a good idea as to what the storm is doing. But don't dismiss that European model solution. It was showing this west-northwest track accurately, and even despite that, it still shows a gradual bend more toward the west within the last 24 hours leading up to landfall. And just to reiterate, if I had to choose the most likely area of a direct impact, I would have to say that the center is likely to pass somewhere near or potentially just south of Barangan City tomorrow night, with conditions rapidly going downhill even before that. So from midday tomorrow onward, you're going to see weather conditions becoming increasingly worse, and the impacts of this storm will be far-reaching. We talked a lot about the coastline in this video, but remember, this storm is going to take quite a long time to significantly weaken, and it's going to make several landfalls as it moves through the Philippines island chain over the next 48 to 72 hours. Again, for Tacloban City, the storm surge and the direct impacts may not be quite as bad as what you saw in Haiyan, but just because this isn't the strongest storm on record, that does not mean you can dismiss this storm by any means. Take all precautions, evacuate away from the coastline, and if you're going to take any kind of shelter in the path of this storm, even if you are inland, make sure that you have a good amount of protection from the wind, as the winds will still be rather strong even as the storm continues to move inland. For more updates, especially if you're in the area, I highly recommend that you stick to the official sources over at Pagasa in the Philippines. But for more supplemental information from the internet, please continue to follow us here at 28storms.com/typhoon, where all of these video postings are located. We also have video updates from our partners on the website. Our partners are westernpacificweather.com. You can go to them directly on their website. And I also highly recommend that you check out the Facebook page iCyclone. This page is run by our storm chaser friend Josh. He has a lot of background with Philippines typhoons. As a matter of fact, he was in Tacloban documenting Super Typhoon Haiyan last year, and he is providing real-time updates as the situation progresses.